I began this study trying to understand the experiences of Zimbabweans who had lived in South Africa for decades and even generations before the outbreak of the 2008 violence in South Africa. But my research took a slight turn when I visited the National Archives of Zimbabwe in Harare in 2009 and came across a file which contained hundreds of documents from the colonial era. One of those documents, generated by the Criminal Investigations Department, made reference to a statement dated November 8, 1941, which was ostensibly written by someone only identified as native Davidson. And here's part of the statement, and I'm going to read it so that you can get to understand what I'm talking about. It was my intention today to proceed to Mafeking. I have no pass to leave the territory, nor have I any papers authorizing my entry to the Union of South Africa. But I've made arrangements to travel on a goods train, which is traveling to the Union this morning. Some time ago, when I expressed an intention of going to the Union of South Africa, I was told by one of my friends, a native named Jack alias Faison, who works in the Railway Telegraph Office, Bulawayo, that he could arrange that I be taken down south by one of the Europeans employed on the railways. He mentioned that the charge would be about £2 and that many natives had been taken down south by this particular person. On the 31st October, 1941, I paid £2 to native Jack, who said he would hand it to the European concerned. He told me that this European works on the trains which travel down south. I saw Jack alias Faison again on Wednesday, 5th November, and he told me that he had handed the money to the European. I don't know the name of the European. Jack told me to be ready on Saturday morning, 8th November at the station, and he would give me a note which had been left with him to give to me for purposes of identification when I joined the goods train. I was told by Jack that he would show me the train on which I was to travel, and there an arrangement would be made with the European as to how I was to travel, whether it was in the goods truck or compartment or on the engine or in the guard's van. I was not able to go up to the station today as I was detained by the police on a native pass charge. So around the same time that I came across this document, there were widespread reports in the South African media of the country being swamped by illegal immigrants from other parts of the African continent. Many of the reports focused on Zimbabwean migrants and cross-border traders who had developed various strategies of evading measures of migration control between the two countries. It was common to hear about Zimbabweans who swam across the Limpopo River, which runs between these two countries, and crawled under or jumped over the South African border fence. Some of those people enlisted the help of unregistered transport operators, locally referred to as Omalaisha, and human smugglers, also commonly referred to as Magumaguma, who removed portions of South Africa's border fence and charged fees for the use of the alternative gates they created. And here on the screen, I have some pictures on the left of one of the crossing points that had become so visible. And on the right, I have a picture of a donkey drawn cart, waiting to collect goods, obviously smuggled across the river. Both pictures, in the background, you see the Limpopo River on the left, really in the dry season, and on the right, again in the dry season, but you can't see, clearly on the much more details on that. Unfortunately, the Omalaisha and Magumaguma often treated the people they helped to cross the border with violence of extreme proportions, such as raping women and assaulting and even killing those who did not comply with their orders. So instead of focusing on the idea of foreigners among Zimbabweans in South Africa, I became more interested to know more about how illegal migration, which I refer to in my book as border jumping across the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, came to be so prevalent and violent. Although researchers were doing a lot to try to understand various aspects of this phenomenon, I could not find any study that took border jumping or illegal migration in Southern Africa as a serious subject for historical research. In fact, the dominant narrative among migration specialists at the time suggested that illegal migration was not an issue of major concern in Southern Africa before the end of colonial rule, and that this phenomenon only became a major concern in South Africa in particular after the apartheid era controls of migration were relaxed in the 1990s. I also observed that scholars and policymakers were sort of easily accepted the idea that rising unemployment and other conditions of insecurity in Zimbabwe and other sub-Saharan African countries were the major drivers of border jumping in the region. But as I got more and more into this research, I learned that making a distinction between factors that pushed people from one country to another and those that forced or encouraged them to cross borders without following official channels helps to better understand the connection between border jumping and the politics of migration control. While it makes sense, for example, to argue that the 1980s civil war in Mozambique and the economic recession that Zimbabwe experienced in the early 2000s compelled many citizens of those two countries to move to South Africa, I argue that such factors did not cause the migrants to use unofficial channels in crossing the border. In fact, most of the people whose experiences I discuss in this book resorted to border jumping only after being denied or having found it difficult to obtain the permits that would have allowed them to use the official channels. More importantly, I learned also that illegal migration or border jumping across the Zimbabwe-South Africa border is actually an old practice that the two countries have grappled with since the inception of the border in the 1890s. Like most interstate boundaries in Africa, which emerged with the European colonization of the continent in the late 19th century, the Zimbabwe-South Africa border was born out of the British occupation of the Zimbabwean plateau in 1890 and the subsequent rise of the country they named Southern Rhodesia, which was later called Zimbabwe. This development resulted in the reconfiguration of what previously was an ordinary river, the Limpopo, running across the Venda territory. There you can see the territory of the, just an illustration of the part of Zimbabwe and South Africa occupied by the Venda speakers. So this development reconfigured the Limpopo River into a juridical divide between the two countries. By 1900, the Southern Rhodesian administration had introduced various measures to restrict the movement of people across the Limpopo. And the Limpopo River is, it runs pretty much across the entire stretch of the border between these two countries. So they had, by 1900, they had, introduced various measures, such as requiring labor agents wishing to recruit workers from the colony for employment in the Transvaal on the South African side to pay much more in registration and license fees than those who were recruited for local employment, and occasionally deploying the police to arrest recruiters operating in the border zone without the necessary permits. In seeking to establish a new type of order in the region, these measures, I argue, disrupted the existing patterns of cross-Limpopo mobility that had become not just a source of livelihood for migrant workers, but also a way of life for the communities on both sides of the Limpopo River. As such, the Zimbabwe-South Africa border evolved as a site of multi-layered contestations, which made it possible for border jumping to thrive from the 1890s to pretty much the present. At one level of these contestations, I see, of course, tension between policymakers in Southern Rhodesia and later Zimbabwe and their counterparts in South Africa, who had different and at times conflicting understandings of cross-Limpopo mobility. Quite often, policymakers were under immense pressure from business owners in their respective countries, especially mine owners and farmers who took advantage of migrant workers from other countries as a source of cheap labor. For example, from the 1890s to around the 1950s, Southern Rhodesian policymakers deployed several strategies in an effort to bring migrant workers from Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and Nyasaland, now Malawi, while restricting migration to South Africa. Meanwhile, their counterparts in South Africa covertly and overtly encouraged the free movement of people across the Limpopo. In this respect, the book goes into to a great length discussing how South African authorities imposed on a ban on the so-called tropical workers in 1913, but then allowed migrants from the restricted areas to continue coming into the country before the ban was officially lifted in 1932. Michel Foucault calls this tolerated illegality, a situation whereby authorities strategically disregard their own laws in order to allow for certain practices to go ahead. I also discuss how South African authorities spend Southern Rhodesia's efforts to organize a regional migration control mechanism during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, bowing to pressure from the Transvaal Chamber of Mines, which insisted that there should be a free movement of labor in the region. However, South Africa changed its approach to border controls in the 1960s when it took the lead in restricting migrations from Southern Rhodesia and other countries. The shift came at a time of rising unemployment among the Black population in South Africa, which also coincided with the end of colonial rule in some of the countries that had been major suppliers of migrant labor to South Africa, for example, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Malawi, and Zambia. There was also an increased militarization of anti-colonial struggles in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And with political tension rising in South Africa itself, the decision to clamp down on border jumping across the Limpopo boundary was also motivated by the desire to stop MK fighters from coming back into the country after military training abroad. In this respect, the South African and Southern Rhodesian governments worked together in managing the border from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s. However, with the coming of independence in Zimbabwe in 1980, tension between the two countries re-emerged, leading to the construction of an electrified fence on the South African side of the border. This is just a portion of the fence, which you can see. I don't know if you can see it clearly on this picture. This was also at the height of the civil war in Mozambique. So the fence was extended all the way to cover the border with Mozambique as well. When apartheid rule came to an end in 1994, relations between Zimbabwe and South Africa greatly improved, but the latter kept a stringent visa regime, which made it difficult for Zimbabweans to freely travel back and forth across the border. It was only in 2009 that South Africa scraped off the visa requirements for Zimbabweans visiting the country for periods not exceeding 90 days. So this is just one level of the contestations that I discuss in this book that fueled border jumping in this region. The book also explores the tensions among policymakers in South Africa, as well as between business owners and policymakers in both countries, and how they also fueled border jumping. But I'm not going to get into further details of those contestations at this point in time. What I want to highlight before I conclude are the activities of people from communities astride the Limpopo River and migrants from other parts of Zimbabwe and from countries such as Malawi, who defied state-centered controls of mobility by entering South Africa through unofficial channels. Given that the conquest of the Zimbabwean plateau came on the backdrop of centuries of cross-Limpopo mobility, the Venda people and other communities in the border zone sought the means to continue with such movements, which were crucial in maintaining their ways of life. During the early 1900s, the most common strategy that border jumpers used was to follow what I call secret footpaths, which helped them to cross the Limpopo at points that the police found difficult to control. When the South African government announced its highly contested ban on tropical workers in 1913, some migrants from Southern Rhodesia had to cross into Botswana or Mozambique's southern districts, where they obtained travel documents purporting to be originally from those countries before proceeding to South Africa. And on this map, you can see some of the routes that they were taking, in trying to avoid the controls. During the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, it was common for border jumpers to pay drivers of private vehicles and freight trains who smuggled them across the border. Although border jumpers continued to use some of these strategies in the post-1960s, South Africa's change of approach forced them to devise new methods. For example, when the South African government installed an electrified fence and deployed armed personnel along the borderline, border jumpers responded by digging holes under the fence and crawling into South Africa, or by throwing blankets or other non-conductive materials on the fence and climbed over it, with the more cunning ones actually using wire cutters to create holes in the fence. As I have already highlighted, it was also common for border jumpers to utilize the services of informal transport operators and other people who helped them to cross the border, often with the help of corrupt state functionaries. By engaging in activities that were prohibited or illegalized, border jumpers expressed their disgruntlement with the manner in which the border was enforced, and in the process undermined the authority of states that sought to regularize and criminalize their activities. So rather than presenting border jumpers simply as lawbreakers, this book views the men and women who illegally crossed the Zimbabwe-South Africa border as rational thinkers whose actions were informed by their understanding of the benefits and risks associated with evading official channels of mobility in the region. So I'd like to end by just saying that it is also often argued that illegal immigration is an indication of the receiving country's failure to secure its borders. This argument is at the center of ongoing immigration debates in South Africa, where the president recently signed a bill meant to tighten the control of the country's borders and make it more difficult for border jumpers to cross. But we've also seen a lot about this in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other countries with large immigrant populations. Although this argument has some merits, the story I tell in this book suggests that tightening border measures does not eradicate border jumping at all. It only makes border jumping more violent and riskier. Over the more than 120 years that I study in this book, state officials on both sides of the Zimbabwe-South Africa border made several attempts to harden the border. And guess what? Border jumpers responded to each and every initiative by devising new strategies to dodge the revised policies. So rather than eliminating border jumping, the attempts to tighten border controls in this region actually encouraged and promoted the use of unofficial channels. I'll end here, and I hope we'll talk more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and we'll move right along to John.
Thank you, Francis, for that overview. That was good. I really liked that. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for having me. Thanks to Francis for inviting me, and to the UK History Department for facilitating this and continuing to host intellectual events in the pandemic world that we all live in at this moment. And it's great to see a global audience for events like this. I think this is the silver lining of the pandemic, because previously events like this would have taken place in Lexington before an engaged audience, but not necessarily a global one. So I'm glad we're all here and able to partake of this, and I too look forward to the Q&A. But first, I have a few thoughts about the book. First, congratulations to Francis for his first monograph. It's a great achievement. And this one is particularly enlightening. So a few interventions that I want to highlight here for those who might not have read the book or haven't read it in detail yet. Just want to frame a few comments here. So first intervention that I see that Francis is making into debates is embedded in his title. And it's this idea of border jumping. You know, Francis is helping to create a new analytical category that encompasses migration, migrant labor, refugees, shoppers, day shoppers, those on longer trips, family visits, you know, people crossing for medical visits, these sorts of things. It describes the act of moving across a border for a wide variety of reasons and allows us to analyze how this phenomenon of crossing has changed across time, to cut across time in which at times crossing was quote unquote illegal, other times it might have been quote unquote legal, or at other times ignored or just not noted. It also allows us to better capture the lived experience of those who live in border districts or in areas where people have to regularly interact with and or avoid the machinery of border crossing. So I think as an analytical category, I really like this idea of border jumping because it encompasses all of these reasons for crossing, some of them longer term, some of them shorter term, some of them with the intention of staying, some of them with the intention of returning that very day. So that's the first intervention that I saw here. The second thing I'd like to note is that this book is an exemplary book for African studies because it melds the way, because of the way it melds the act of doing historical archival research to provide some really important insights into the ways the border was constructed from the time of conquest in the late 19th century all the way through the 20th, with some great ethnographic work on the border itself around the turn of the 21st century and in the first 2 decades. And that's a really impressive feat to pull off because those are very different skill sets, mining the archival record and also being able to cultivate the contacts necessary to do an ethnographic field survey of a contested border. That by itself is a very difficult feat. This work is particularly timely and critical because, as Francis pointed out, he happened to be working at the time of one of the greatest moments of political turmoil in Zimbabwe's recent history. And his research captures in immense and fine-grained detail the situations that ordinary Zimbabweans and South Africans living near the border faced during some of the more tumultuous years of the late Mugabe regime. Also, as we historians face an uncertain future around ill-funded state archives, and we wonder what they might actually be preserving for future generations, it's primary source collection and documentation like Francis has done here that might end up being the most invaluable contribution of this book to fields of Zimbabwean studies, Southern African studies, borderland studies, all of that, because he is documenting the challenges of crossing and why people are doing it at a time when the archives may or may not be capturing that, and it may or may not be available in the future to historians and others interested in these sorts of issues. In terms of the overall argument of the book, the intervention I found most significant was his finding that across time periods and on all sides of the border, there were, quote, legitimate actors, end quote, like border guards, politicians, leaders of business and industry, labor recruiters, farmer organizations, that actively worked to formulate policies to make crossing illegal for their own gain. There were, of course, some who were playing it straight, working to make it easier at various times as well, but it was the ones looking to make it illegal that forced border jumpers of all forms into more dangerous and more profitable for smugglers crossings. I think this conclusion needs to be taken more seriously by scholars of borders and borderlands. Though I think that most of us who study borders know this on some level, whether they directly write about it or not. But more importantly, it needs to be taken seriously by policymakers and advocates for migrants, refugees, and other border jumpers. Lots of people profit from the existence of borders that prey on the most vulnerable, those who have to cross the border for whatever reason and cannot count themselves among the lucky few who have diplomatic connections, business connections, or are part of the political elite. For these people, increased border checks are a hassle and can suck away valuable time, but they are rarely the dangerous proposition that border crossing is for the most vulnerable. And this book does a really good job of arguing that the policymakers need to take note, and it documents the vulnerability of those who are forced into the irregular channels for a wide variety of reasons. in the interest of not taking up too much time, I will just commend Francis on two other points here where I think his book does a really good job with things that are not easy to do in any book, but much less a first monograph. The detail on border jumping throughout this book is really impressive. By nature, those who cross borders without going through formal checks oftentimes do not want to be found. But Francis found many of them. And as he noted in his introduction, he attempted to portray them, and I thought he did a very good job of this, as fully fleshed out human actors, full of emotion and the motives that were, as he notes in the book, fully rational, even if sometimes they had to risk life, limb, wildlife, high rivers, and the law to cross the borders. I was much impressed by how you managed to tell the story of the border jumpers in all time periods here, despite the wealth of evidence, especially for the earlier periods, being from the official sources. It's a great testament to your ability to read the archives sideways, upside down, and every other way necessary to excavate these stories. And then the second point I'll make is, despite being a book about borders, this book actually ends up being a very detailed and nuanced social history of Zimbabwe for the period of 1890 through about 1960. The amount of detail you bring in here on labor migration and labor history, economic history, as well as the political and diplomatic history of the relationship between Southern Rhodesia and its neighbors, not just South Africa, is immense. And yet, despite that, the narrative remains legible and clear, and it doesn't even feel cluttered. It was detail that you fully needed to include to explain the range of border jumpers who crossed over, but in less deft hands, it would have made for a turgid and plodding book. This is not that. This was a highly readable social history of Southern Rhodesia from which I learned a lot as a Lesotho specialist. It's never easy to meld the high political history of a territory with the stories of individual people, but you nicely pulled off the balance and did so in a way that was engaging even for a non-Zimbabwean specialist like myself. And with that, I would highly encourage everyone to read the book. At this point, I think we should turn to some questions for Francis. I have a long list that I will not bore you with reading all of. Francis has them via email, so he can grapple with them in time if he so chooses. I might just throw out one or two questions before we open the floor to the audience, though, in sort of a discussant's privilege here. So maybe the two I will throw out to you, Francis. One is, I would like to hear a little bit more in your words about the construction of Bight Bridge in 1929 and how this changed the landscape for border jumping. I was very intrigued by your narrative and how little South Africa seemed to care about the border with Southern Rhodesia in the early 20th century until about 1960. But the presence of a bridge over the potentially dangerous Limpopo River, I would think that changed the dynamics greatly. And so I'd just like to hear a little bit more, and I think others might be interested to hear about how that changed some of the dynamics. And then the second question I had was, one thing you didn't really deal with in the book. You mark 1960 as a key turning point because of the armed liberation struggles and the increased African nationalism in really all territories across the continent at that time. But another big change that happened right at that time was South Africa leaving the Commonwealth. Of course, Southern Rhodesia had at that point, somewhat ambiguous relationship with the Commonwealth, and they too would leave it not too long after this. But I wonder what effect that had on border jumping, because I know down in Lesotho, the border was very easy to cross because of this Commonwealth status, despite the ambiguities of how South Africa dealt with the Commonwealth. So I guess I'd just like to hear perhaps a little bit more on what effect that might have had on those attempting to cross borders in the region, whether it's directly from Zimbabwe to South Africa or on one of the alternate channels, say through Botswana.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate the comments and the compliments. As you were just commenting, I felt like, wow, is that my book that is describing? But of course, I could relate with the details because I know I know about the details. I really appreciate your very close reading of the book and the way you outlined your comments. I would like to begin with your second question about the South Africa, leaving the Commonwealth and what that probably meant. Yeah, that's something that I guess is a challenge that I probably had with my sources. I never came across any possible impact that the leaving of the Commonwealth was could have been a decisive factor at this point, at the point that South Africa made that U-turn in terms of its approach to the management of its borders with Southern Rhodesia and other countries in the region. What I saw, and you probably, and some of the people here who have worked on South Africa history, you're probably aware of the Frontman Commission of 1960. Or 1961, which was a commission that the apartheid government put in place to look into this issue of foreign labor or foreign bundles, as they were called. And the commission came up with a lot of recommendations. And of course, you probably know that the commission was never made public document. But they came up with a lot of recommendations, one of which was to reduce the influx of foreign migrants, as they were called, foreign bundles. The question is, why? I read through, because that's the document, the report that they submitted to the apartheid government is, you see the government, even if they didn't make that document public, they actually begin to implement the recommendations, almost point by point. I must admit that I didn't see much reference to the Commonwealth. And of course, around that time, that's when South Africa, of course, you said it's pulling out and establishing the Republic, as they called it. What I see their concerns being the most is, of course, rising unemployment among the local Black population in South Africa. It being also a result of apartheid policies, especially the group areas Act of the 1950s, which led into the reorganization of communities, of course, into racially segregated areas, and of course you have forced removals and what have you, and so there is the issue of people losing their sources of livelihoods, but also pretty much being being assaulted by the apartheid regime, and that is also happening at a time where you see the intensification of anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa itself. And as you rightly pointed out, this is also around the time when Lesotho is becoming independent, Botswana, Swaziland, you can also talk about Zambia and Malawi. And that also has an impact in the sense that these had been major suppliers of migrant labor to South Africa. And them becoming independent and Black ruled changed the dynamics, because they renegotiated the contract that they had with apartheid South Africa in terms of the supply of labor. So I see a lot of that, and of course the idea that the ANC and other political parties in South Africa, they're coming together to form the Umkhonto weSizwe, and they are sending people out to train with the intention of coming back to fight. In South Africa, you see. Those are details that I didn't see in the Frontman Commission, but you see also the impact that made in the thinking of the administration in terms of actually changing the direction of their border control policies. So I'll be very happy to look into the Commonwealth. Maybe I'll convince my publishers to do a second edition, and maybe include that. But that's I'll be very happy to look into that. And then the question about Beitbridge. Yes, those of you here who may not know, before 1929, it was just a river and those rudimentary checkpoints that were put here and there. And the Limpopo River really is not always in flood, right? There are times when you can actually cross, anyway, especially in the winter. And so the construction of the bridge changed things in a number of ways. One is that, of course, it made it possible for private vehicles and, of course, people to cross even during, the rain season, which was which they could not do, before without the bridge. Illegal migration or border jumping was generally slowed down during the rain season when the Limpopo River was in flood. But now with the Bait Bridge, you see, of course, people actually attempting to cross right at the bridge itself. And in some cases, and I reference one instance where migrants believed to have been from Malawi actually had to use violence, because immediately after the bridge was built, they put a checkpoint, which the Southern Rhodesian authorities were very much interested in policing. Not so much, or South Africans were not so much interested, even if they contributed financially to the construction of the bridge, and also actually built, they extended the railway line from Cape Town, in which it ended in Messina. They extended to the bridge. And of course, you see also on the Southern Rhodesian side, there's also the further development of the transport network. But on the South African side, they were not, even at that point, 1930s, no, they were not interested. So in terms of South Africa's approach to border management, the bridge didn't change much. But on the Southern Rhodesian side, on the Zimbabwean side, you see them actually making use of the bridge, in many ways establishing a police station and further checks, because they knew that in the rain season, a lot of human traffic was going to be to be directed towards the bridge. So, but again, you see people being driven by private vehicles to the point near the bridge, and they get off. They find other ways of crossing, especially in winter, and then they get back into the vehicles after the vehicles had crossed over the bridge. So you just see some modification of the border jumping strategies that came as a result of the bridge. I don't know if that addresses the question.
No, that's great. I think those are both really comprehensive answers. Yeah, no, I think the Commonwealth it could use some further exploration, because I know from my own work in Lesotho that was a big moment because of the fact that they were now classified as foreign natives. People of Basotho were then, once the Commonwealth exit happened, but it sounds like the situation was somewhat different in Southern Rhodesia. So that might be an interesting contrast to look at in a possible venue for a side project here, looking at, how many Zimbabweans ended up in Botswana, for instance, trying to get British papers in the late colonial period so they could be, seen as Commonwealth. But I think at this point, I'm going to cede the floor and let others ask questions, because I think there's a great audience here, about 50 people. And, if discussion flags, I can ask lots more questions, but I think it would be great to hear other voices. So I'm not sure if Karen or Emily is going to be doing this, but I will turn it over to whoever's next.
Sure. Thank you so much, John and Francis, for your really stimulating conversation about a great book. The floor is open for questions. We already have a first hand, so I'll just turn it over to Steve, and then I will continue to call on folks in the order that I see your hands. If there's some questions that accumulate in the chat, I'll bring them to your attention from time to time. So Steve Davis.
Thank you. So first off, congratulations, Francis. I haven't had the pleasure of reading the final draft, but my reading of the manuscript was that it was a very strong work, and I look forward to seeing the finished product. So I have two questions. Your book makes a number of provocative interventions into the literature on political economy in Southern Africa and the relationship between political economy and migration. you make an argument that these are rational. These border jumpers are rational actors. But I wanted to probe that question a little bit further and ask: are there not layered rationalities at work in colonial situations in Africa? Like, did the colonial experience not impose multiple ways of justifying and explaining onto colonized peoples as a way of kind of contending with their situation? And in this regard, I'm thinking of Jeff Perez's work on the cattle killing, where he kind of identifies a number of bracketed rationalities that colonized peoples can move between local ideas and explanations and ideas that they've been exposed to by virtue of conquest and colonization. So do you see border jumpers as exhibiting a similar bracketed rationality that can both explain their actions in terms of local belief and logics, but also be part of the sort of classic economically rational actor that we see in conventional political economy? I'll save the second question. I don't want to take up too much time, but that's my primary question. I'm sure we'll have conversations about this later.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I think what I see, I don't know much about bracketed rationality, because that's a notion that I have not quite engaged with. But if my understanding of what you are saying is correct, what I see happening here is a group of people, maybe without even, some of them without even a sense of group identity, or a category of people who had for a long time before the inception of the border, established some connections, right, across what was just the Limpopo River, or what could have been just the Limpopo River. And now you have the colonial dispensation is giving a new meaning to the Limpopo. Now it's a colonial boundary. And what I see here happening is there's a conscious attempt by people to continue living as they had done before the reconfiguration of the Limpopo River into a colonial boundary. So you see that, especially among the communities I just mentioned, the Venda-speaking people who had actually established, some people have referred to as the kingdom or an empire, as Venda Empire across. That's on both sides of the Limpopo River. So you see some conscious efforts to continue living with life as if the border did not mean anything. They continue to send their young ones from the Southern Rhodesian side to the Transvaal side or South Africa side for initiation ceremonies, for instance, and vice versa, right? And even you see marriage practices, people marrying across the river, which they'd done before. Sometimes if, moving after getting married, someone moves, whether it's a man or the woman. So they try to consciously continue with that. But you also see, as time goes, you see that consciousness that things have changed. You see them also making efforts to obtain to obtain permits that they would have, they would need to cross the border, and in cases where that was easily possible, they did it. But in some cases, they continued to basically disregard. And I saw also that sense of deliberate defiance, defying the colonial stipulations on how people should cross the border. So it is from my reading of that I feel that these are rational actors. They know what they're doing, and they know why they're doing that. And in some cases, perhaps not in every case, they know the risks that are involved, the implications of their actions. I don't know if that addressed the issue of bracketed or layered rationalities. I don't know.
I think it did. I mean, if I can ask one follow-up. So does the standard push-pull model of migration, does it account for spiritual beliefs and local practices in a way that makes sense? Or do we need to go back and revise that push-pull kind of conceptualization of migration?
Right. I think you're right. That's part of what I'm trying to do, what I'm doing in this book, to say, if you take any text on the migration in Southern Africa, historical texts, even some of the texts that are being produced, that have been produced over the past few years, talking about the more contemporary time period. You see, there's a lot of emphasis on the push-pull factor. There's a crisis in Zimbabwe, and of course there are employment opportunities and other opportunities in South Africa, and this is why we have the rise in border jumping. And I'm saying, well, that might be true, but there's more to it, and let's pause and dig deep into this. And part of what I'm arguing here is that not everyone who is leaving Zimbabwe to South Africa, and John did a good job to also talk about this. Not everyone who is leaving Zimbabwe going to South Africa is looking for a job in South Africa. And not everyone who is leaving Zimbabwe going to South Africa is intending to stay in South Africa for a long time. You have people, especially those who reside in the border region. They go to South Africa in the morning to buy, and they come back later in the day, right? And these people, most of the time, they don't bother about having a passport. They don't bother about getting a visa, and they don't bother about going to Beit Bridge to cross via the bridge. They know how to cross even when the Limpopo is in flood. They know how to cross. They don't need boats, right? Yeah. And so those are some of the things. And actually, part of what I'm doing here is to argue that labor migration or migration for the purpose of looking for jobs in South Africa, or movements across this border for the purpose of looking for jobs, is probably just a small percentage of the movements that are taking place or that have been taking place across this border and through unofficial channels. So what I'm doing in this book is to actually say that the conventional push factors, they do apply, but not quite so in this case. We need to dig deep into what is happening in this situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. So we have a full docket of questions, so I'm just going to go in the order that I've seen them. Next, we have Monica Blackman-Bizona.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you very much to all the participants. It's wonderful to see so many people. And I'd also like to say thank you, Francis, for inviting us to share in your ideas. I have not yet read your book, and I have to go and buy it immediately, because it's clear to me that some of the issues that I'm thinking about in my own research as an art historian, having to do with the border between Ivory Coast and Ghana, are really going to be clarified by your book. And I think it's interesting that the population that I'm particularly interested in, the Nzema, who live on both sides of the Ghana-Ivory Coast border, are great artists, as are the Venda. The Venda are really known in art history for their sculptural traditions, their pottery, their cultural contributions to the arts of South Africa. So maybe there's something very stimulating about being border jumpers. So I'm really interested in looking at the beginning of your book particularly. But I have a very practical question that was sort of launched by one of John's questions about the bridge. As you know, when I was a child, I lived in Malawi, and so I had the chance to cross from Malawi into what was then Southern Rhodesia on a number of occasions via Tete, on a pontoon ferry. And then I also had one very quick trip into South Africa via Beit Bridge. I was really surprised that there was no, I mean, your talk makes it sound as though there was no ferry. There wasn't a platoon that was pulled across the river by a boat, and then it was pulled back the other way, and if the ropes broke, then of course the ferry goes downriver until people can catch it. And this is really, ferries are really important in the history of Malawi, because when we were in Malawi, there was a rebellion, Chippenberry, and his forces were on one side of the Shire River and the capital was on the other, and the ferrymen were loyal to President Hastings Kamuzu Banda, so they refused to take the soldiers across the river, and so the rebellion failed. At least that's the story we heard. There's no ferry across the Limpopo River. It's a very simple question, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I lost part of the question. Are you asking if there was a ferry across the
right.
Before the bridge?
Surely before the bridge, there was a way of crossing the Limpopo River, which did not involve swimming.
Well, yeah. I mean, even the local people had developed some what you would call homemade canoes. They had, I mean, it's not everyone who was just going to swim when the Limpopo was in flood. They had their canoes that they used, but of course a lot of the crossings, and I've come across even documented stories of some of those canoes and the problems that they had, and also interestingly how the spiritual element got into the use of those canoes. If you there was a story of some of the people who owned and directed the canoes would ask people before they got into the canoe, because obviously it was they were not, properly meant for the job, and they would ask people to confess if you had any muti or traditional okay. Interestingly, my wife is requesting to use my camera. I don't know what that means. Okay, I'm going to decline. I don't know. But anyway, so what you see happening is I've come across these stories where people, the directors of these canoes would say, if you have any traditional medicine, which was a very common practice among migrants. They would carry some medicine for protection along the way, and also when they get into, mostly those who were going to work in the underground, in the mines, they believed that those charms or other things would protect them so that they would not fall into, So the ferry owner would say, or the canoe owner would say, if you have anything like that, you have to confess. Or if you have done anything wrong where you are coming from, or if you have intentions of doing harmful things where you are going, you have to confess before you get onto the canoe. Why? Because there was that belief that if the canoe carried someone like that, it would capsize. It would basically overturn and of course it result in an accident. So they were border crossing methods or methods of crossing the river like that. I mean, for sure they were there.
Francis, is that in your book, the description of what you would need to confess to? I mean, it's really interesting for, I think, probably the anthropologists on this call, and then for people like me who would like to know, like, what does the Limpopo not like? And then usually those kinds of confessions involve adultery. So is that a problem? It would be fun to learn more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we have 25 minutes and I have 7 questions on the docket. So what I'm going to suggest is that I'm going to ask a couple of people to ask their questions, and I'm also going to relay a couple of questions from the chat, and maybe Francis, you can respond to them kind of in a batch. Do you feel comfortable with that?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So just 2 questions from the chat that were mentioned. So Luke asks, what you mean by an irrational actor, to kind of clarify the role of that term within your thinking in this book. Nicholas Neachega says, I like that you talk about communities who live in the Beitbridge borderland. Can these people be called borderlanders rather than border jumpers? That's an interesting question about a continuum rather than a break, right? And then of the folks with their hands raised, let me just ask 2 folks to ask their questions first, and so that Francis doesn't get overwhelmed. We'll start with Kudakwashe Vanura. I'm sorry about my mispronunciation. So we'll start with Kudakwashe and then Hosseina. If you could each ask your questions, and then Francis can talk about all 4 of those.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Francis, for your book. And I mean, I haven't read the book yet. So I'm a doctoral researcher at the African Center for Migration and Society Advanced in Joburg. I'm really happy that we've had a chance to, have this engagement. And this is kind of, I think, the pros of being able to connect in this way. So I know you come at this from a kind of historical perspective, and I really appreciate that, because there isn't so much. So I just finished my own PhD research looking at the Zimbabwe-South African border, and one of the things I struggled with is getting sources around sort of the history. So you end up citing two or three authors who've basically written about the border, or have to draw on other secondary material that makes reference to kind of 3 or 4, 5 key scholars or key texts. So I think it's important that a book like yours is quite a valuable contribution. I wonder though whether you how much of the book engages at the border from the sort of the contemporary, if you can call it that, or the sort of the post-colonial Zimbabwe, South Africa, or Southern Africa more broadly. And in this regard, I wonder whether the sort of Zimbabwean crisis, for example, is a useful lens to look at how perhaps we can question how much of it has to do with migration, which you outline in terms of labor mobility. We can speak of some sort of coerced movement that's based perhaps on the Zimbabwean crisis, and then the border in itself does sort of allow for some sort of permeability. But I wondered how much we can talk about the border being constituted through, or reconstitute, or reconfigured, as it were, through the lens of the Zimbabwean crisis, and the foreign policy kind of regime. Does it always align in terms of how the border becomes more permeable or less permeable? It's a matter of whether Zimbabwe is in crisis or not, or whether there's a humanitarian crisis or not. And I'm coming from with this question from the perspective of someone who's looking at how sort of humanitarianism is also kind of shaping that border, and how there is something we can say about that space with regard to the Zimbabwean crisis, or whatever contemporary, whatever the global economy and whatever is happening right now is causing into that space. I wonder if there is space in the book to look at that, not necessarily as a way to satisfy, the requirements about time or whatnot, but to understand whether you can kind of draw a pattern between how the border changes. Does it respond to, and how the border is policed? Does it respond to certain conditions in Zim, for example? That can also just be a heuristic to look at not only how South Africa, the border is constituted through Zimbabwean migration, but I guess other forms. But I would be interested to hear whether you kind of zero into, I know Hamas has done an interesting kind of analysis looking at how the border is constantly, or the regulation of Zimbabwean migration and at the border is constantly shifting according to how South African foreign policy, for example, is looking at. So how the ANC would not sort of close that border completely, but at the same time, they wouldn't make it too open for Zimbabweans because, you know, of the xenophobic attacks, and it would make them look bad among their voting constituency, who are dominantly the urban Black poor. But yeah, let me just leave it at that. But thanks again for your book. I look forward to reading it.
Right, and then Hussein?
Emily, can I respond, and then we go
okay,
to.
Okay, yeah, we'll start with Hussein for the next one.
Yeah, I just thank you so much. I just wanted to. I think Kuda's question was, you know, I just wanted to make sure that I don't forget a lot of what he said. And by the way, thank you so much, Kuda, for the question. And congratulations for recently defending your dissertation. We are personally looking forward to reading the dissertation and possibly the book that comes out of that. And for those of you here who may not know, Kuda is at the African Center for Migration Studies, where I actually, began my, work on migration in general. I've been with the African Center for Migration at FITS for quite a long time, and I value the connection. So I want to begin with that question. Firstly, of course, looking at if what the contemporary state of affairs has done, maybe did in my analysis of the history that is unfolding, or that is unfolded in this region. If I give the impression that my reading is informed by contemporary developments, of course that might be right, because that's where I began. I began my questioning of what is happening in this region after having observed things that were happening around 2008, 2009, and just trying to understand how did we come to be like this? How did we come to be here? And then I went back to the archives. But what you see is a very interesting, but also almost quite different scenario. It has not always been about managing a crisis. Of course, the crisis in Zimbabwe, the economic crisis, political crisis, has had an impact in terms of how the border has been managed. And I deal with that in my in chapter 5 of the book. I get into a lot of detail with that. But what I try to do is not just to, and again, this gets us into the push-pull conventional analysis debate. It's not just to say we are seeing the increase in the number or the increase in border jumping simply because there's a crisis in Zimbabwe. That I accept for sure, because the crisis is pushing people out of Zimbabwe. But what I see is the thing that generates this border jumping, or that fuels this or promotes border jumping, even during the time of the crisis in Zimbabwe, is the manner in which the border is being managed. And here's why. Before South Africa scrapped off the visa requirements in 2009, you had a lot of even the violence, in the border area, the Magumaguma, Malaicha, just the reports of violence, they were much more than what we saw after the South African government scrapped off the visa and allowed people who had passports, who wanted to cross the border officially, to do that without having to go through the trouble of having to show in their bank accounts that you have so much money, and to tell the government that I'm going to South Africa to do A, B, C, D, and that you have a hotel reservation, or you have an invitation from a relative who lives in South Africa, or that you're a civil servant in Zimbabwe, all those things. When they just made it possible for Zimbabweans to just cross. All you have to answer is, where are you going? How long are you going to be in South Africa? Do you have a passport? They stamp your passport, you go. That helped a lot, of course, in reducing the level of violence and the prevalence of border jumping. So yeah, of course, the crisis in Zimbabwe has had an impact, but I'm more interested in how policymakers respond to those crises in terms of how they manage cross border movements, and in this particular case, of course, migration across the Limpopo. And the question about irrational actors, I don't know if I got that correctly, because I think what I'm arguing for here is that we need to look at these people not just as law breakers, not just as people who are illegals, but as people whose actions and practices are informed by rational analysis of the situations that they are confronted with. Of course, if I may make reference to the crisis in Zimbabwe, yes, that's a situation that they are confronted with, but also when they think about crossing the border, there are a lot of hurdles that they are confronted with, which if the policymakers could do something about those hurdles, some of these people would actually cross the border through the official channels and not through the unofficial channels. So I think that's the argument I'm making here. And about borderlanders versus border jumpers, that's Nicholas. That's a great question. I agree with you. They are borderlanders. In the sense, at least from my reading of this history, in the sense that these are people who reside in the borderland, but they often jump the border a lot. They do jump the border, and for them it's probably their way of life. I interviewed a lot of people on the eastern side of the border the border, so towards the border with Mozambique, and one of the questions one local teacher asked me is, hey, we, and this was in 2009, and he was like, we do not have, enough foodstuffs in our shops here, and just less than 2 kilometers across from here on the South African side, shops are full. But then you expect me to go almost 100 kilometers from here to Bait Bridge, so that I could cross officially through the bridge, get a visa and cross officially, while I see shops that's just less than 2 kilometers from where I am. It doesn't make sense. And around that time, there was not even adequate transport systems, that would help those people to travel from that part, the Chikwarakwara area, from that part to Bait Bridge, because there were no buses. The roads were not in good shape. And he was like, does it make sense? And also another problem around that time, which gets into the issue of the Zimbabwe crisis, it was very difficult to get a passport if you were a Zimbabwean. Just you would apply and wait for months, to get a passport. And it was also expensive to get a passport. So he was like, it doesn't make sense for the officials to expect us to do that. And in any case, most of the people who are residents, the borderlanders, like Nicholas put them, they have IDs for both countries. They have IDs for South Africa and IDs for Zimbabwe. And so sometimes they play the games of what is convenient, and they do what is convenient. And this is also why I refer to them as rational actors. I don't know if, I think we can move on to the next batch of questions.
Okay, yeah, so if we could ask the next 3 people to ask questions to take maybe just 1 to 2 minutes to ask your questions so that Francis can respond to them. Thanks so much for your patience. So Husseina Dinani.
Yeah, thanks Francis for this talk, and I'm so glad that I'm able to hear you talk at length about your book, even though I've heard renditions prior to when the book came together. So very quickly, I want to ask a question related to rational thinkers, but more around the concept of resourcefulness, right? And over here, I'm sort of thinking about, it seems like in the book, you do talk at length about, you know, the reasons why people cross the border. They've had previous sort of kinship networks, various, you know, networks that they've created, whether they're economic or familial or what have you. And, you know, as the policing of the border is sort of becoming more stringent, it's sort of impacting the degree of violence. And so, you know, perhaps trying to think about resourcefulness, not in terms of just what it is, which is, you know, to operate as a rational thinker. I'm wondering if you could say something about what resourcefulness does, right? And by this, I'm really sort of thinking about, you know, my own work was just sort of situated in gender. What does it mean? How important is it to maintain, let's say, the ability to go ahead and be part of a ritual, or you know, an initiation ritual, right? Considering that this border is evolving and its surroundings are evolving. And I'm just sort of thinking about, you know, if you could say something about what being a rational thinker does in terms of, you know, resourcefulness, in terms of the stakes involved, right? And I'm sure it's done throughout the book. And then just very quickly, if you have time, what are the authorities on the Zimbabwean side doing, right? In terms of, because I'm sort of thinking this is sort of, they might be seeing this as an exodus of potential laborers, or, you know, however they're sort of conceptualizing or categorizing people who are living in Northern Rhodesia. And you know, what sort of gatekeeping strategies are they putting in place? And how does it sort of complicate perhaps border jumping? Yeah, so I'll just leave it to that. And yeah, thanks. This is great.
Thanks. And Anthony Jongwe?
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, I am joining in from Pretoria in South Africa. I had a chance encounter with Francis at the University of Joburg when he had come for the writing workshop on the book. So that was prior to the national lockdown here in South Africa. So I'm really glad that despite all the drama of the national lockdown, Francis has been able to complete the book. That aside, I think his book is very relevant and timely because right now there is talk here in South Africa not about a Zimbabwean crisis, but a Zimbabwe crisis in South Africa. And this is mostly to do with the cumulative impact of a lot of illegal immigration that has been taking place from Zimbabwe to South Africa. And because South Africa's economy is limping badly out of this coronavirus pandemic, there is now pressure on the politicians to do something about stemming this issue of illegal immigration, especially from Zimbabwe. So I think the book has got serious policy implications for Southern African development community. And I would like to applaud you, Francis, for an excellent job. Well done. I look forward to buying a copy for myself and actually going through the contents. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And then our final question, Emmanuel Matambo.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Professor, for your wonderful book. I look forward to reading it. And of course, thanks a lot to John as well. He talked quite well about the book. So I have two quick questions. The first one is that in 2016, Prof, you wrote You wrote an article in the Journal of Southern African Studies documenting the ritual called Chimwanakazi or something like that, about how girl children are used in Zimbabwe to appease the spirits of those who cross the border into South Africa, but then do not make it because of fatalities and death. So did you delve into that in the book, and what exactly does the ritual entail? And then the second quick question is, you just, in your previous response, you spoke about the teacher you interviewed who says it is not feasible for me. It doesn't make sense for me to travel hundreds of kilometers to Bedbridge and then cross over only to access a shop that is 2 kilometers from where I stay. Did you have any prescriptions about that? How can that be dealt with? Do you think it feasible yourself, or are you trying, if I may use the word excuse, are you trying to excuse the fact that those people would find more sense in just crossing the border over illegally, but then still return back to Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Okay.
We have just a couple questions from the chat. I don't know if you want me to go ahead and read them now or give you the chance to respond to these questions. I've saved the chat so I can send them to you, and we can go about 5-10 minutes over 1:30. What would you prefer?
Let me respond to the three questions. I mean, the three discussions, and then we can go to the charts.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe you can help me with the charts, because when I look at the charts, I lose track of the other.
No, I have them saved for you, but we'll just try to keep to just 1:40 at the outside. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So all right, let me start with the last question from Emmanuel Matambo. Thank you so much, and good to see you, Emmanuel. I remember being part of your presentation at Johannesburg back in February, March. About am I justifying what these people are doing, and what is my thinking about this? I mean, it's part of what I'm doing in this book to say there's something that needs to be done here. We are focusing on the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, and I'm saying it's not just, let's not just brush this aside as a result of the Zimbabwe crisis. There's something deeper that is going on here, and history, and with my skills as a historian, I can help you understand what's going on here. And this is what I think I'm doing, to say that policymakers need to look into this issue much more closely than they've done so far. Definitely to expect people like the teacher that I was talking about to take all the trouble to go through the bureaucratic hurdles that they have to go through to get just a passport, which should be something that everyone should get by birthright. And then they struggle to get a permit to cross a border, which crossed their communities, by the way. This border found these communities there. And this border found these, cross-Limpopo interactions and engagements there. And to expect, and to just disregard all that, I think it's not the right way of thinking in terms of border management. And by the way, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the South African border, not border management, but South African international migration green paper that they published, I think in June 2018. I felt like it was on the right path to address this, because they were very consciously addressing the issue of colonial legacies in terms of the colonial histories of these borders and the pre-colonial cross-border migration trends. And by the way, it's not just South Africa. You see this all over the African continent, where the borders crossed communities. And in those cases, you always had challenges with the so-called illegal migrations, and also this aspect of smuggling. So that's, and I'm not the first one to make this argument. If you read, Professor Nugent's work in West Africa on the Ghana-Togo border, if you read David Newberry's work on the Congo, Rwanda border, you will get to understand more about this. So I am not condoning the illegal acts, but I'm saying, I mean, we need to think deeper about what is happening here rather than just to dismiss them as lawbreakers. And then to the issue of the rituals, I'm sorry that I don't talk about this in this book. Hopefully, if I get another chance, I will develop that article into a book project. I don't know. Probably if I get another chance, I'll do that. But what Emmanuel was talking about is some of the people, especially from areas outside the border zone, who were migrants to South Africa, got killed by the border residents. And now the spirits of those people who were killed come back to hound the people who killed them, and they are dealing with this issue, using this ritual manner. So that's what Emmanuel was talking about. And then to Anton Jongwe, thank you so much. Except that this is not the book that I was working on in March. That's a separate project that I was working on in Johannesburg in March. That one is coming soon, I hope. But again, you did point out something about the Zimbabwe crisis in South Africa. And this is where the recent bill that I mentioned in my preliminary remarks, is coming from. That President Ramaphosa signed a bill in June in the context of, I think it's called the Border Authority Management Act, which was signed recently in June in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And the idea basically is to say that, as many of you probably know, South Africa has the highest number of cases of infections and also deaths in Africa, I guess, in the entire continent. And I guess what is happening here is that they were trying to deal with that and many other things. And of course, one of the things that came out is that they have too many units and departments dealing with the border management or migration management issues, and they wanted to synchronize and put all that under one authority, but also to just tighten the security management of the borders. Yes, it has a lot to do with Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwean crisis, because you have a lot of Zimbabweans, in South Africa. But I also think that it just shows where we are in terms of thinking about borders and their meaning in Africa. One of the questions that John sent to me before this discussion was to encourage me to think about the future of borders, or maybe the future of the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And if I was going to say that if we had this conversation before Corona, I would probably have a different view. And what I would probably be, wanting us to engage with is the African Union's Agenda 2063, which does not talk much directly about borders per se. They talk about, creating more, you would say, more connection between and among African citizens, the idea of having a common passport, or like a African citizenship, like one citizenship throughout the entire country. And recently talked, the idea of having like a continental free trade agreement that was recently signed into some real legal document, and many other things, including even having one airspace and maybe one train network connecting the entire, the most of the major cities. When I read that document, I see that, or I'm confused. Let me say, I'm not quite sure exactly what to say about this. There was a time when I really believed that this is the future for Africa. And what that meant is you would have less restrictions in terms of population movement within the African continent, so much so that you would not need a passport to go to South Africa. You would not need a passport to go to Niger or to Nigeria if you're a Zimbabwean. Just like I don't need a passport or to show my passport if I'm going to Ohio from Kentucky, or if I'm going to Tennessee from Kentucky. I don't even have to stop at the border. So I thought that was the the future for Africa is contained into, is contained in that document by the Agenda 2063. But of course, coronavirus, and even before coronavirus, the change of leadership at the African Union Commission kind of watered that down. So I don't know as of now where we are headed, but that's a conversation that I would want to encourage our policymakers, even at regional and continental level, to engage with. And in terms of Husseina's questions about authorities in Zimbabwe and what they are doing on their side of the border, part of what I did in my preliminary remarks was to say that from the 1890s to the 1950s, they were trying to block, because of this labor, need for labor, they were trying to block people from going to South Africa. In the meantime, they were trying to welcome those from the north, from Malawi and Zambia, but then blocking the southern part of the southern border to say people should, because they need the labor, right? But then after independence in the 1980s, 90s, 1990s, the Zimbabwean, post-colonial Zimbabwean government does not seem to be bothered much about that. They only come in when it comes to maybe crime prevention or something like that. Except, there was a time, 2008, 2009, when there were allegations that they were not processing people's passports because they didn't want people to leave the country. But that's up for debate. And also in terms of resourcefulness, that's a very good question, because you see this at different, people being conscious about first and foremost, their positionality in terms of what is going on in terms of this mobility. People who come from the border region, which I think Nicholas said, the borderlanders, they have a very different understanding of the cross-border, the movements across the border as compared to people who come from further upland, right? And so they use their understanding, they use their connections, their networks, even across the border, and the idea that many of them have South African IDs. They use those resources to interact with the border in different ways. I mean, in ways that may be different from the manner in which people from Malawi, for instance, or Mozambique, who first get into Zimbabwe and then try to cross into South Africa via the Zimbabwe-South Africa border. What you also see, and I think I addressed this a little bit in my talk, but I deal with this in the book. In the early periods of the colonial period, the early years of the colonial period, you see people from the eastern side of Zimbabwe, or Southern Rhodesia then, who had cultural connections with those on the western side of Mozambique. At the time that the South Africa was trying to stop those from the north of the Limpopo River from getting into South Africa, they would use those connections to get IDs as if they were Mozambicans. And the same applies on the western side. People would cross into Botswana, get IDs as if they are from Botswana, so that they could be allowed to cross into South Africa legally and not illegally. So that's an indication of how people are conscious about the resources around them and how they were making use of those resources. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Francis. I think that in the interest of time, what I'll do is send you the number of questions and comments and well wishes that are in the chat and end things here. I wanted to, finish up this really stimulating session by thanking again Francis Musoni, as well as John Ernie Fleissner for his comments and for leading us in this discussion, from which I learned a lot, and I'm sure that everyone else felt lucky to be able to step into the office of Francis and to learn so much about what's been taking up your time in the past few years. So thanks so much. And our next history workshop is going to be 2 weeks from today. And so if you're not on the list and you would like to be, feel free to send me an email to learn more about that. All right.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you all for taking part in this. Truly, it would have been nice to do this in person and to at least sign some copies. I know some of you were saying, I look forward to reading the book. I look forward to signing those copies. And the book is available for sure. It's there. So I hope to hear from you, and yeah, we can continue the conversation. Thank you. I really appreciate seeing familiar faces, people that I have not seen in a long time. Thank you so much.